And time now for our Down to Earth segment, which of course focuses on the health of the planet. Some 60 nations are gathering in the coastal city of Santa Marta in Colombia to tackle an issue which has deadlocked UN climate talks: how to exit fossil fuels. It's the first global conference of its kind, bringing together countries which want to accelerate a fossil fuel phase-out. This despite the stalemate in the UN-level COP summits. For more on this, I'm joined by our Environment Editor Valerie Dekimpe. Hello, Valerie.
Hi, Annette.
Tell us more about the purpose of this gathering. I mean, is this summit trying to achieve what countless other summits have failed to do so for years?
The gathering was born out of the frustration that 30 years of climate diplomacy have failed to produce any meaningful outcome on fossil fuels, which we know are the main drivers of the climate crisis, with this key question: how do we move away from oil, coal, and gas? And so the summit is co-hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands, two countries that are part of a coalition of about 80 countries that want to accelerate efforts aimed at phasing out fossil fuels. This coalition is already active within the COP ecosystem, the official UN climate summit. But last year at COP30, those countries, that coalition, said, if we're not making enough progress, we're going to take discussions out of formal UN negotiations. And so essentially you have countries responding to a gridlock situation that has become a feature of climate diplomacy and COPs, and saying to the rest of the world, okay, if you're not willing to phase out fossil fuels, we will do it anyways, with or without you. Previous COPs have only led to very limited calls to phase down fossil fuels as opposed to phase out fossil fuels. And even the term fossil fuels was only included for the first time in a final COP decision just a few years ago. And so that shows you how much of a sensitive issue it has become. COPs have mainly focused on on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, emission reduction targets. But the big elephant in the room is what's actually behind those emissions, what's driving those emissions, and it's fossil fuels. And so now countries really want to tackle production head on.
Now, the world's biggest fossil fuel producers, however, didn't attend. So as a result, does that cast a question over this gathering's credibility?
Well, you mentioned it. The US, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia are skipping the event. China is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, a major consumer of fossil fuels as well, even though they're also the leader in renewable energy production. The US and Saudi Arabia, two of the world's largest oil producers. So all of those countries are not present now in Colombia. And so it raises the question of, can this coalition of the willing go it alone without actually having the world's biggest polluters on board? Colombia's environment minister was asked about their absence. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
We can look at it the other way around. When the largest emitters have been present at COP negotiations, those same countries have been the ones pushing for a veto and avoiding discussions of the need to make a transition beyond fossil fuels.
In other words, they're the ones slowing us down, so let's try to make progress on our own if they're actually not present. And so also referring to intense fossil fuel lobbying that we have seen in recent COPs. She also said that this new alliance of countries wanting to exit fossil fuels are a new force to be reckoned with. More than 50 countries accounting for almost 50% of the global population. You have a mix of both consumer nations, producers from the global north, the south, and so really showing that there's actually a global consensus to exit fossil fuels. Colombia is actually an interesting example because they're one of Latin America's leading oil producers. But their reasoning behind really wanting to push hard ahead with a fossil fuel exit is that fossil fuels have become a liability. They have become a risk for economic and energy security. And the current conflict in the Middle East is really providing a strong argument to them to show that we need to do this.
So as a result, can anything concrete come out of this meeting?
Organizers have been very clear that this is not a COP. This is not a space for negotiations that will lead to a treaty. They actually want to avoid the same consensus building model that has led to so much gridlock at COPs. And so there's not going to be a negotiated outcome out of this summit with all countries having to agree. But there's going to be guidance for how countries can actually exit fossil fuels. There have been proposals to designate areas where oil, coal, and gas extraction are off limits. They're being called fossil-free zones. And the summit will also see the launch of the first scientific panel dedicated to the energy transition, which, ironically, they will be reporting back to the COP31 presidency. So again, the COP ecosystem. But again, they do want to make progress outside of official agreements, but they also need to influence what's happening there.
Valerie Dekimpe, thank you so much for that. And coming up next is the latest in world sports.